Welcome back to the garage. In this episode, we're finally going to start putting things back into the car, like the dash. We'll also put a Porsche into a Porsche, and we've got some pressing business with the trailing arms, getting the old bushings and pivots out. Let's get started. I removed the trailing arms in a previous episode, and I now have one of them here in the shop press against the arbor plates. I've got a little notch in between these plates, creating a hole so that the pivot can fall right through. I'm not going to protect the top part here, the threaded part, because I don't intend on salvaging this piece. Pressing through rubber on a shop press isn't quite as dangerous as other things because it doesn't create a lot of tension, but you still have to watch yourself. And mine's a little squeaky. So I'm going to take a socket here that's bigger than the threaded part and an extension, and I'll put that in, and then I can just kind of press on that. Again, there's not a lot of force here, so I can use a socket extension. More squeak, just because I thought you'd like to hear it. Now what I'm going to be doing is going with progressively longer extensions so that I can push the pivot through. I'll put a longer one in here now and drop that in. And now, through the magic of editing, condense a lot of time and hear more squeak. And I'll just keep this process going, just using a mix of a small extension, a medium extension, and a long extension. You can see that half of it is out already. And I'll just reorient the arbor plates, make sure that they're solid, and put the pivot through there, stick in my extension, and then just keep the process going. It's a lot easier to change up these extensions than it is to just go with a really long extension and keep moving this work surface up and down. And we're almost there. Just one more small extension. And it's out. Now I know not everybody has a shop press and people are constantly trying to figure out ways to work around them. But the fact is, with companies like Harbor Freight, you can get a decent one, at least for the work that we do, for under $200, especially with a coupon. So it saves you a lot of work, it saves you a lot of time and effort. It's probably worth it. Now here on the bench, I'll pull one of the bushings that almost came out on its own. This is an OEM bushing. And you can see that there's nothing really special about it, just a simple rubber bushing. It's not glued in or anything, just wedged in, and looks a lot like the new bushing. Now I'll just make sure that the inside here is nice and clean with no corrosion, and we'll get this other bushing out. Now this one's still kind of installed, so I'm going to take a small vice grip and just pull on it. You could use heat to kind of burn them out, but they're not really wedged in there that tight, so no need to go through the stink. I'll just keep pulling on this, and then you can kind of twist it out. No problem. So here's the OEM bushing, and here's the new one from 914 Rubber, and you can see that the new one's just a little bit wider, and there's also kind of a bevel, a taper at the top that the OEM doesn't have. But in terms of length, they look pretty dead on. Well, let's see how this new one fits into the arm. Yeah, it's about the same tightness too. With all the suspension parts out and taken down, it's time to go to the powder coater. All right, so here's a Porsche in a Porsche. I gotta be one of the only people who drives to the powder coater in a Cayman. And while the powder coater is working his magic, let's spend some time working on the dash. All right, so here's the dash that I restored in another episode. My son's giving me a hand putting it back in the car. It's so cool to see parts actually going back onto this Bumblebee. Now I won't put the dash all the way in because I need to have some access for the wire harness below. A bunch of this has to be routed through the dash. So what I'm going to do is reach up and take these switches and get them in position first. This wire and a bunch of others will be tucked inside the dash. You can see kind of a wire hold down in there. That's what's going to keep things secure, and then the wire runs the whole length of the dash. So this is the part of the harness that belongs to the climate controls. And then I snaked behind the dash these wires, which go to the door switch. And then these, of course, are for the instrument cluster, the warning lights and such. And then down below, we have the ignition switch, wires, and then the turn signal and wiper connections. So everything's kind of where it should be. Now I'll start installing the headlight switch by holding the switch in the back and then turning the escutcheon screw until it holds the switch. And I'll do that for the hazard one here and for the fog light as well. And then for these escutcheon rings, I've got this special tool. Now I got this one from my 65 Mustang, but it fits on this car. It's got a hole in here so the stud from the switch can fit inside, and then these little nubs will work into those little slots. I put this in here and then just tighten until they're snug, and I'll do that for all the switches. Then all that's left is to take the knobs themselves and spin them on. Probably going to get fresher knobs, but for now this works. And you can see the little light bulb that goes inside the hazard light, which is fun, and the fog light switch. All good. And now things are starting to look a little bit more like a car. Okay, the dash is set and the parts are back from the powder coater. You gotta love the sight of all these great parts, freshly reconditioned and shrink wrapped, powder coated, and ready to be reinstalled on the car. It's a work of art. So much cleaner. Perfect. And so here on the bench is my beautiful, freshly reconditioned trailing arm. And you can see here that there's no powder inside. This guy's good. He just made sure that the powder hung around on the lip, but not inside where the bushing goes, which is pretty critical. You don't want powder in there. Now here's our new bushing from 914 Rubber, and we want to try to put this in without lube. Now I know that sounds painful, but we don't want to take a chance that the bushing will rotate or kind of cave in as we press in the pivot later. So I'll try to put it in dry. I could use heat to make it a little bit easier to press it in, but it doesn't require a lot of force. You can really get it most of the way in with just your hands. Use heat if you feel like it, but it doesn't seem like you really need it. I mean, the real grip of this bushing happens when the pivot goes in and it presses against the wall. It's all very tight tolerances. I'll just hit it with a dead blow hammer here and a piece of wood to make sure that it's all the way home. And that's pretty much it. You want to make sure that it really is right up against the lip. And now we'll just turn it over and get the other one done. Okay, here we have the OEM pivot and the 914 Rubber pivot. And the main difference that you notice here first is the weight. The OEM one is much lighter. It's hollow, and they actually welded the ends onto it. The 914 Rubber one is made of solid stainless steel. It's really hefty. It weighs about maybe 5 or 6 pounds more, but it's very strong. And it's turned to be exactly the right tolerance on the bearing ends, and the length and everything else is exactly dead on. The main difference between the two is that the original ones have these little ridges around the ends, and those kind of lock into similar ridges that are on the suspension ears. And the 914 Rubber one doesn't have those ridges, but they do supply this serrated washer which digs into the pivot and keeps it from turning while it's on the car. You don't want these to turn. Now I'm just going to take some measurements here to make sure that the other side of this doesn't hit an arbor plate or anything while I'm pressing it in. So I'm just standing the pivot arm up against the trailing arm, and I'm going to make a mark where I believe the threaded part will almost hit the arbor plate, and make sure while I'm pressing that it's totally clear, because you can easily damage the threads. So I'll take a nut here and just thread it on till it's almost flush, and that will protect the threads as I'm pressing on this side. And now back to the star of this episode, the shop press. So here's my 20-ton Harbor Freight shop press, and of course it's got a lot of adjustability here, and we're going to need to raise up the level of this thing as the pivot bar gets pressed in. Got arbor plates down here. In the beginning I'm going to use just the flat solid part, and then as we get closer to the point where the pivot shaft needs to pop through, I'll slide these over and make sure that the hole is open so the pivot can drop right through. So we're going to shoot some soap inside. Can't have too much. Nice and lubed up. Same thing on the other side. Put some soap on this. Lube it up good. And now we can start pressing. And again, it doesn't require a lot of force. You can just hold the arm here. Just be careful, as always, with a shop press. And it doesn't hurt to add more soap, especially at the beginning. You want to make sure that the lube gets right into the bushings. Now I've gone as far as I can go. Got to readjust the work surface. I'm still using the flat part of the arbor plate because there's nothing to protrude yet. I just keep going and adjusting the work surface and adding more soap every couple of presses or so. So you can see that the pivot is pushing its way into the bushing there. I'll give another shot of soap. Create a little bit of a smaller hole here to make sure that the bushing has a place to rest while the pivot goes through. You can see that the bushing is resting on the arbor plates. That's keeping it from popping back out. All right, it's in. And now while the trailing arms are out of the car, it's a great time to press the bearings in. I can see that some flash rust started to form since the sandblasting and the metal was totally bare. So I'm just going to take care of that, clean it up with some really fine sandpaper. Got some 1000 grit here. Could go with 600, doesn't really matter, but there isn't that much flash rust in here. Just want to clean it out. Make sure it's ready to accept the bearing. And now I'll just hit it with a little bit of grease, not so much to help the bearing go in, but to give a little bit of protection to the metal, make sure no more rust forms. I don't know about you, but I'm getting hungry. Time to raid the downstairs freezer. Let's see. Sausage, turkey, no, bearings. Yeah, that's what I want. All right, let's get this new bearing out. Doesn't it look delicious? Well, these particular bearings can go in either way. Some have kind of more of a chamfer on one end than the other, but this one seems to be pretty identical, so I'll just place it in. The trick is to get it in really, really straight, really square. You can see that it's frosty still. Now I'm just using a little bearing press tool here to get it started. Just tap it lightly, make sure it's straight, then bring it over to the press and let it work its magic. Now I'm pressing against the arbor plate. You don't want to press on the bearing, you want to press on the arm, so I'm using that tool inside the arm to press it down and the bearing against the plate. Okay, I feel a change in resistance there, so I know it's done. And our trailing arm is finished. We've got a brand new bearing in there that spins smoothly. We also have a freshly powder coated finish with a new pivot and bushings from 914 rubber. Now I may need to shave some of the bushing down to make sure that the contact is right on the car, but we're done. Well, as you can see, things are really coming along now. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so you can come along for the ride. Thanks again to 914 Rubber, as always, for providing so many great parts for this build. Please give the video a thumbs up. Thanks a lot for watching. Be safe and enjoy.